The Middle Eastern desert is a cruel, indifferent teacher. For the 80 US Army Rangers embedded in a 10-vehicle Stryker column, the lesson was about to be written in fire and sand. They were conducting a deep penetration sweep through a rugged, basalt-strewn canyon, a jagged, narrow scar in the earth that the maps promised was a low-threat transit route. The American commanders, relying on the sanitized comfort of their high-altitude satellite reconnaissance, had checked the boxes. They had the thermal overwatch, they had the encrypted comms, and they had the confidence of a force that believed it could dictate the terms of any engagement. But the canyon had a memory. It was a place where generations of insurgents had refined the art of the ambush, turning the sheer, vertical rock faces into a multi-tiered trap. The first indication that the precision intelligence had failed wasn't a digital ping or a flickering sensor. It was the gut-wrenching, bone-shattering thud of a 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine gun tearing through the lead vehicle's engine block. The Stryker, a 20-ton behemoth of modern urban warfare, slewed sideways, its tires shredded, effectively plugging the narrow gorge like a cork in a bottle. The ambush was instantaneous. Rocket-propelled grenades, fired from positions high up on the canyon's rim, positions the Americans' thermal imaging drones had dismissed as geological noise, began to rain down on the column. Within seconds, the canyon floor was a chaos of screaming metal and detonating fuel. The Rangers did exactly what they were trained to do. They exited the vehicles and sought cover, bringing their sophisticated rifles and high-end optics to bear. But they were fighting a ghost. The insurgents were firing from crevices and caves that were effectively shielded by the natural rock, making them invisible to the Americans' laser designators and thermal sights. Then, the true enemy arrived.
It started as a low, ominous vibration, a hum that seemed to rattle the very marrow of the soldiers' bones. Within minutes, the horizon vanished. The desert, unpredictable and savage, unleashed a massive, localized haboob, a wall of sand so thick and so abrasive that it turned high noon into a suffocating, pitch-black night. The fine, mineral-rich dust got into everything. It choked the air intake of the Strykers, rendering the surviving vehicles useless. It clogged the soldiers' weapon actions, causing jams that turned their rifles into expensive, heavy clubs. Most importantly, it killed the American way of war. The Reaper drones, the pride of the US Air Force, were forced to ground, their sensitive lenses scoured by the abrasive grit of the storm. The satellite-linked communication suites, which were supposed to provide a seamless, real-time picture of the battlefield, went completely dark. The heat-seeking optics, the all-seeing eyes of the American Rangers, were blinded. The desert was filled with the thermal signature of the storm itself, a swirling, hot mess of static that rendered the thermal cameras useless. 80 Rangers, the elite of the elite, were suddenly reduced to fighting the most primitive, basic form of warfare, a blind, sensory-deprived survival struggle in the dark. They couldn't call for air support because the Apaches were grounded, terrified of flying into the blinding dust cloud. They couldn't call for artillery because they didn't know where the enemy was, and they didn't know where they were themselves. They were trapped in a stone cage. They were being hunted by an enemy that knew the terrain by touch, by the sound of the wind, and by the memory of the ground. The Rangers were firing blindly into the storm, wasting thousands of rounds of ammunition, while the insurgents, moving through the narrow, twisting goat paths of the canyon, were picking them off with terrifying, quiet efficiency. The panic was infectious. The American command center, located 40 miles to the rear, was experiencing a complete systemic collapse. They were staring at blank monitors, screaming into microphones that were met only with the hiss of atmospheric interference. They were looking at a dead screen and, in their hubris, refusing to believe that they had lost control. They were planning phased tactical withdrawals and artillery suppression fire missions, while the men in the canyon were running out of water, running out of ammunition, and realizing that their multi-billion-dollar technology had left them utterly, nakedly alone. It was the ultimate humiliation of the high-tech superpower doctrine. They had built a military that was a master of the clear day, the perfect signal, and the guaranteed connection. But the desert doesn't care about your satellite uplinks. The desert doesn't care about your procurement budget. And the desert, in its infinite savage wisdom, had just stripped the US Army of its digital crutches, leaving them to face the reality of the fight, raw, bleeding, and terrified. Why is it that the American military machine, with its infinite resources, remains so utterly convinced that tech superiority is a substitute for the ability to fight in the dark, without a screen to guide them? Why does every US operation have to be so dependent on the connection that the moment the Wi-Fi drops, the entire force effectively ceases to exist? Is the American approach to modern combat a bloated, inefficient relic of a bygone era? Or is there something deeper, more systemic, that makes them so reliant on crutches? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Do you believe the US military's obsession with all-seeing technology has actually made them weaker in the field by atrophy of their basic survival skills? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the next 24 hours of American failure are a masterclass in how not to fight a war.
We are about to dive deep into the kind of incompetence that normally gets scrubbed from the official record, all while a 4-man British SAS Mobility Troop is about to ignore their orders, grab 4 dirt bikes, and show the world exactly what professionalism actually looks like. The Americans are waiting to die in the dark, but the British are already moving. Stay tuned, because the real mission is just beginning. The scene inside the US Forward Command Center was less of a tactical operations room and more of a high-tech funeral parlor. $300 million worth of satellite terminals, real-time telemetry servers, and encrypted networking racks were currently doing exactly nothing. The desert's fury, a relentless wall-to-wall sandstorm, had turned the entire spectrum of American technological superiority into a digital graveyard. General Miller, a man whose career had been carefully manicured in the halls of the Pentagon, stood before his wall of screens, his face a twitching mask of professional dread. Every single monitor was broadcasting a uniform, soul-crushing static. The Reaper drones, those multi-million-dollar eyes in the sky that the US military worshipped as the ultimate arbiter of the battlefield, were grounded. Their sensitive optical sensors had been scoured by the micro-abrasive dust of the storm, and their flight computers had triggered emergency loiter protocols because the pilots in Nevada were effectively flying blind. The Apache gunships, the iron-clad chariots of American air superiority, sat on the tarmac of the forward base, their rotors lashed down, their expensive targeting pods shuttered to protect them from the relentless, grinding sand. 80 Rangers were trapped in the canyon, and the US military's response was, quite frankly, a tragic comedy of errors.
"General," an intelligence officer stammered, his voice trembling as he looked at a data pad that was reading 0 packets of information from the canyon sector. "We have no telemetry from the Stryker internal diagnostics. We don't know the status of the men. We don't know the status of the vehicles. We've lost the GPS handshake on all 64 handheld units. We are completely, functionally, stone deaf and blind." Miller slammed his hand onto the console, the sound cracking like a pistol shot in the sterile silence of the tent. "Send in the recovery armor. Get the Abrams battalion moving. If we can't see them, we'll drive to them. Use the heavy treads to push through the dunes and create a perimeter." It was a command born of panic,
a desperate, flailing reach for the heavy force. But the desert, in its indifference, had already sabotaged that path as well. Within 30 minutes, the reports started trickling back in. The heavy armor battalion had moved out, only to find that the Sandstorm had turned the approach road into a shifting, liquid nightmare of drift sand. 3 of the lead Abrams tanks were already high-centered, their tracks spinning uselessly in the soft, bottomless dunes. The recovery vehicles were stuck behind them, creating a massive, immobile bottleneck of steel that was now sitting ducks for any insurgent team with an RPG-7 and a sense of timing. The Americans were caught in a loop of self-destruction. They had spent 48 hours trying to force a heavy solution onto a soft problem. They were burning millions of dollars in wasted fuel. Their logistics chain was failing, and their pride, the one thing they guarded more jealously than their own men, was being shredded. And then the real horror began to settle in.
The comms traffic from the canyon, which had been silent for hours, suddenly flickered back to life with a single, harrowing message, intercepted by a distant, high-altitude surveillance relay that was barely clinging to the edge of the storm. "This is Ranger Actual. We are pinned. Casualties are heavy. We have no support. We are..." The transmission cut out, replaced by the terrifying rhythmic crackle of automatic gunfire. The general staff looked at each other in absolute paralyzed silence. They had the ability to rain death down on a city from 5,000 miles away, but they couldn't help 80 men who were dying 2 miles down the road. They had built a military system that was a master of the push-button war, the kind where you drop a bomb, check a box, and go to lunch. But they had forgotten how to fight a war of presence, the kind where you have to actually be there, in the mud, in the wind, in the dark. They were paralyzed by the protocol. The protocols dictated that you don't send infantry into an uncleared kill zone without air suppression. The protocols dictated that you don't attempt a ground-based rescue without a verified real-time battle damage assessment, BDA. But because the tech was down, there was no BDA. Because there was no BDA, there was no go-ahead. And because there was no go-ahead, the men in the canyon were left to be slaughtered. It was the ultimate, bitter humiliation of the Pentagon's doctrine. They had outsourced their tactical judgment to machines, and now that the machines were offline, the humans had forgotten how to function. They were acting like children who had lost their favorite toy, pacing the room, yelling at the screens, and refusing to accept that their entire worldview had just been dismantled by a bit of weather and some grit. "General," the intelligence officer tried again, his voice lower. "We've got reports that the local insurgent cells are moving in. They're using the storm as cover. They're closing in on the Ranger positions. If we don't act, we're looking at a total loss of the unit." "I know what we're looking at," Miller snapped. But his voice lacked the steel of a commander. It was the voice of a man who was terrified of his own shadow. "We're waiting for the storm clearance window. That's the SOP. We wait for the weather to stabilize. We launch the Apaches, we clear the path, then we extract. Those are the rules." "The rules?" the officer asked, a hint of genuine madness creeping into his tone. "The rules are currently killing 80 Americans, General. While we sit here waiting for a weather window, they are being picked apart." The failure wasn't just in the tech. It was in the mindset. The US military had become so bureaucratic, so obsessed with managing the battle from afar, that it had created a generation of officers who were incapable of taking a risk. They were terrified of the post-action review, the inevitable, career-destroying investigation that follows any failed mission. They would rather let 80 men die under the cover of following SOP than risk their reputations on a maneuver that didn't have a 100% success rating on a simulator. They were the big machine,
and the big machine was currently eating its own tail. Every minute that passed, the Americans' reputation in the region was being eroded. They were seen as the clumsy giant, the loud, destructive invader who could smash a wall but couldn't protect his own people. The insurgents were filming it all, recording the American impotence and sharing it across the globe, creating a propaganda victory that was worth more than 1,000 suicide bombers. But while the general was busy preparing his strategic explanation for the loss of the unit, a small, quiet, and profoundly dangerous group of men was standing in the shadows of the motor pool. They weren't waiting for the storm to clear. They weren't waiting for a drone signal. They were the SAS Mobility Troop, and they were currently tightening the chains on 4 mud-caked, stripped-down KTM 450 cross bikes.
They didn't have helmets with heads-up displays. They didn't have radios that connected to the Pentagon. They had rifles, they had compasses, and they had a level of professional, cold-blooded audacity that the Americans had relegated to the history books. Why do we keep pouring billions into a system that produces General Millers, men who are terrified of the dark, instead of the kind of soldiers who can turn the dark into their greatest asset? Are we witnessing the inevitable, slow-motion collapse of a force that has become too complex to exist in the real world? Drop a comment below. Do you believe the US military's obsession with procedural perfection is the greatest threat to its own survival? Is the American approach to managing war a way to hide the fact that we've lost the guts to actually fight it? Subscribe and hit that bell, because in the next block, we are going to see what happens when the big machine meets the ghost patrol. The Americans are still waiting for the sky to clear, but the British are already riding into the heart of the storm. Stay tuned. The Yankee ego is about to be ground into the desert floor. The atmosphere in the US command tent was suffocating, thick with the smell of overheated server racks and the acidic tang of professional panic. General Miller, a man whose career had been a seamless ascent through the ranks of the Pentagon, was currently screaming into a dead radio, his face a bruised purple of frustration. Every satellite feed was black, every drone was grounded, every major weapon system, from the Abrams tanks currently sinking into the dunes to the Apache gunships lashed to the tarmac, had been rendered useless by the sheer, chaotic violence of the desert storm. Standing near the perimeter of the command deck, watching the entire American tactical apparatus implode in real time, were 4 men from the SAS Mobility Troop. They didn't look like the supermen of the US Special Ops brochures. They looked like 4 guys who had spent their entire lives in the dirt. They were lean, weather-beaten, and remarkably unremarkable. They were currently checking the oil levels on 4 stripped-down, ruggedized KTM 450 crossbikes, their movements deliberate and focused. They didn't have headsets. They didn't have GPS units. They had compasses, physical maps of the canyon system, and a level of cold, pragmatic aggression that made the nearby American staff look like schoolboys. The SBS lead, a man the US officers had nicknamed the Ghost for his uncanny ability to be in 2 places at once, stepped up to General Miller's map table. He didn't offer a salute. He didn't even acknowledge the general's frantic shouting match with the Pentagon's crisis desk. He simply placed a thick, gloved finger on the canyon entrance. "General," the Briton said, his voice a quiet, abrasive rasp that somehow pierced through the general's shouting. "You've spent 48 hours trying to manage the situation with tanks and drones. You're fighting a war that requires surgical movement, and you're trying to do it with a sledgehammer. The storm isn't a tactical challenge, it's a cloak. You're just too damn loud to use it." General Miller spun around, his eyes wild with the stress of the impending catastrophe. You're going to walk into that sector with 4 dirt bikes.
Do you have any idea how many RPG teams are currently zeroed in on that canyon? We have lost 2 Abrams tanks to mines. We have air interdiction teams that have been shredded. What makes you think 4 guys on motorcycles are going to survive for more than 10 seconds? The British operator looked at the general with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. Your tanks are slow, heavy, and have a thermal signature that can be seen from space. Your troops are terrified of moving without a drone watching their back.
We aren't going to survive because we're smarter. We're going to survive because we're invisible. We don't need a satellite to tell us where the rocks are. We don't need a radio to tell us when to pull the trigger. We have 4 bikes, a map and a compass. Give us 30 minutes. The American colonel standing behind Miller stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. 30 minutes? You're talking about an 8-mile ride through a live fire zone in the middle of a haboob. If you go out there, you're just going to turn into target practice. We're waiting for the weather to clear so we can launch a coordinated, high-density air assault. That is the only way to save those Rangers. The SAS operator didn't blink. He just tapped the general's map one last time, his finger leaving a smudge of dry desert mud on the expensive laminated surface. Your coordinated assault is the reason those men are dying. Every time your helicopters spin up, the insurgents retreat into the caves. Every time your tanks advance, they set off the mines. You're giving them exactly what they want, a fight they can win. We're going to give them something they can't fight. Silence. He turned on his heel and walked out of the tent toward the motor pool. The American officers stood in silence, watching the 4 Brits prepare their machines. The motorcycles were beautiful in their simplicity. No heavy fairings, no unnecessary lights, no digital dash consoles. Just stripped-down frames, high-torque engines, and wide-tread tires designed to chew through the soft, treacherous shifting sands of the canyon. They're going to get themselves slaughtered, a voice muttered from the back of the tent. It's a suicide mission. They're going to leave their bodies in that canyon, and we're going to have to spend the next week writing the incident reports. Maybe, another officer whispered, watching the British team kick their bikes to life. A sound that was lost instantly in the howling wind of the storm. But look at them. They aren't acting like men who are going to die. They're acting like men who are going to work. The SAS operators didn't look back at the base. They didn't need the comfort of the big machine. They weren't tethered to the general's command net. They were heading out into a wall of sand that would have grounded the US Air Force, trusting only in their instincts, their training, and the magnetic pull of a needle inside a compass housing. They were the invisible force that the Pentagon had spent billions of dollars to replace, only to find that when the chips were down, the replacement didn't work. General Miller stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching as the 4 riders vanished into the swirling, blinding wall of dust. He felt a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, the realization that he had effectively surrendered his entire mission to a group of men who didn't even report to him. He was the general, the man with the nuclear codes, the man with the carrier group, and the man with the entire US Army behind him, and he had just been rendered completely, utterly redundant by 4 guys on motorcycles. He looked at his radio, waiting for the emergency call that would signal their failure. He was terrified of the mission failing, but he was secretly, deeply terrified that it would succeed. Because if 4 men on bikes could do what 200 Rangers and a company of Abrams tanks couldn't, then the entire structure of the American military-industrial complex was a lie. The desert wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to mock the idle tanks and the grounded drones. The SAS were in the storm now, moving through the dunes like sharks in a deep black sea. They didn't need the satellites.
They didn't need the overwatch. They were navigating by the feel of the wind and the grain of the sand, moving toward the canyon at speeds that would have snapped a Humvee's axle.
Why do we continue to support a military system that is so terrified of risk that it loses the ability to act? Is the US military-industrial complex just a giant, bloated machine that exists to keep the contractors rich, while the real warriors are left to deal with the consequences of its incompetence? Are we building an army that can win on a spreadsheet but is destined to lose in the dirt? Drop a comment below. Do you believe the US military will ever admit that a dirt bike and a compass are more effective than a drone swarm? Or is the big machine too in love with its own noise to ever stop? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. The next block is the most insane, terrifying, and brilliant thing you will ever see on a battlefield. We are going to ride into that storm. We are going to show you how 4 men turn a death trap into a killing floor. The Yanks are waiting for the B-52s to clear the way, but the British are already clearing the rooms. Stay sharp. The haboob was a suffocating, churning wall of pulverized quartz and iron-rich dust, a sensory nightmare that would have grounded the entire US 5th Air Force. For the 4 SAS operators, it was a tactical camouflage of godlike proportions. They rode their KTMs into the heart of the storm, their navigation reduced to the erratic flickering of a luminous needle inside a handheld compass housing and the visceral, grinding feedback of the desert terrain through their handlebars. They didn't have heads-up displays or laser-linked tactical networks. They had an intimate, terrifying knowledge of the canyon's topology. As they entered the mouth of the gorge, the wind was a physical force, screaming through the rock formations like a choir of the damned. The SAS team maintained a perfect, loose-linked diamond formation. Their distance from one another adjusted perfectly to the acoustic dead zones of the storm.
They were moving at 40 miles per hour across basalt shards that would have shredded an MRAP's tires in seconds. They didn't use headlights.
They moved by the faint, shimmering silhouettes of the rock walls, their bodies leaning into the turns with the fluid, instinctual grace of men who had spent years training to fight in conditions that the rest of the world considered impossible. They reached the hidden approach, a narrow, steep-angled drainage chute that the American intelligence officers had ignored because their drones had labeled it inaccessible to heavy transport. The SAS didn't need heavy transport. They drove their bikes directly up the 40-degree slope, their engines screaming in a high-pitched mechanical howl that was swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. They reached the ridgeline overlooking the fortress, dropped their bikes in a concealed gully, and moved on foot. The silence they maintained was the most dangerous weapon they possessed. They didn't use the frantic, over-modulated radio chatter of the US Rangers. They used hand signals, tiny, precise twitches of the fingers that communicated intent with zero acoustic signature. They moved toward the fort's rear guard, a cluster of 4 DSHK machine gun nests that were currently firing periodic, nervous bursts into the storm, trying to hit shadows that weren't there. The SAS operators were within 10 meters before the first guard even realized he was being hunted. The point man, G, didn't stop. He stepped out of the swirling sand, his C8 carbine, a weapon refined by decades of SAS field experience, pressed against his shoulder. 2 rounds, suppressed and deliberate, punched through the guard's chest armor. He didn't scream. He just folded. The 3 remaining insurgents were neutralized in a flash of controlled, surgical violence. The SAS operators didn't spray the area with lead, a hallmark of American suppression tactics. They fired exactly what was required. 2 rounds for the head, 1 for the chest. They secured the machine gun nest, muted the firing, and then moved to the next. It was a 20-minute masterclass in CQB, close quarters battle. They were ghosts, cutting through the insurgents' perimeter defense like a razor blade through wet silk. They breached the fortress's rear ventilation shaft, a cramped, filthy tunnel that the Americans hadn't even dared to look at on their satellite scans. Inside, the heat was stifling, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. They found the 8 American Rangers huddled in a sub-basement storage room, their hands zip-tied, their faces a portrait of broken hope. The insurgents guarding them were distracted by the distant, thunderous percussion of the US tank bombardment outside, unaware that the real war had just walked in through the floorboards. The SAS team lead raised his weapon, the red dot of his optic finding the temple of the lead insurgent. Thwip, thwip. He fell, his AK-74 clattering against the concrete. The second operator swept the room, taking out the remaining guards with the same rhythmic, emotionless efficiency. They didn't fire a single shot that risked the hostages. They didn't call for a breach and clear team. They just did the work. "Rangers," the lead operator said, his voice cutting through the dust-filled air. "We're the SAS. Get your boots on. We're leaving." The Americans looked at them as if they were angels of death. They had spent 48 hours waiting for $1 million rescue, and they were being pulled out by 4 men in mud-stained tactical gear, armed with rifles that weren't covered in battery packs, and led by a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They moved the hostages back into the tunnel. They didn't sprint. They moved with the agonizing, controlled speed of a snake. They knew that the moment they emerged, they were back in the kill zone. They reached the exit point just as the storm showed its first sign of thinning. The SAS lead checked his watch. 43 minutes had elapsed since they had entered the tunnel.
The Americans they had just rescued were shaking, their adrenaline crashing as they realized they had been spared from the very strike General Miller was still planning to unleash. They were the collateral damage Miller had been prepared to sacrifice to hide his own incompetence. The SAS didn't give them time to thank them. They didn't give them time to talk. They led them across the dunes, keeping low, using the remaining sand swirls as cover, until the shapes of the US tanks finally loomed out of the haze like prehistoric sleeping monsters. The Americans at the staging area were still staring at their screens, still arguing with the Pentagon, when a call crackled over the emergency frequency. Not a satellite link, but a simple ground-level radio pulse. "This is the SAS. We have your people. We are 500 meters north of your perimeter. Stop your damn tanks. We're coming in." The command tent erupted into a cacophony of disbelief. General Miller looked at the screen, a grainy, low-light feed that finally showed 4 figures walking out of the Sandstorm, leading a group of 8 men. He didn't cheer. He didn't scream. He just stared, the reality of the moment crushing the air from his lungs. He had been beaten at his own game, by his own rules, and by his own colleagues. He had spent 2 days trying to turn a stone fort into a smoking crater, and he had been shown up by 4 men on motorcycles who hadn't even broken a sweat. The American overmatch doctrine had just been effectively dismantled. Why do we continue to prioritize the big, loud military narrative when history consistently shows that the real work is done by the small, quiet, and disciplined professionals? Is the military-industrial complex just a giant machine for protecting its own ego? Drop a comment below. Do you believe the US
will ever admit that a dirt bike and a compass are more effective than a 100-man tank column? Or is the theatre of war too important to their image to ever let go of the big, noisy toys? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because the final block is the most humiliating walk of shame the US Army has ever had to endure. You aren't going to want to miss the look on Miller's face when he realizes he's just been shown how to fight a war. Stay sharp. The dawn broke over the Iraqi desert, not with the grace of a new day,
but with the harsh, unforgiving glare of an interrogation lamp, exposing the scene of the American military's most profound public failure. The command tent was a static-filled cage of incompetence. General Miller stood by the perimeter, his dress uniform pristine, his face a twitching mask of professional agony. He had been minutes, seconds, from launching the B-52 strike, a final, desperate act of strategic arson meant to incinerate the evidence of his own paralysis. He was staring at his watch, the second hand sweeping toward the final, fatal deadline of the 45-minute window he'd given the Brits. He was already composing the internal report in his head. Despite the reckless, unauthorized intervention of the British team, the rescue failed. Total strike was the only remaining option to prevent insurgent control of the site. He was ready to burn the history books to save his own career, ready to bury his mistakes under a blanket of cratered earth. And then, the sound of movement shattered the silence. It didn't come from the front gates, where the Abrams tanks sat like monolithic statues of rusted, impotent steel. It came from the scrubland to the north, 100 meters away from the primary armored perimeter. 4 silhouettes emerged from the swirling, settling dust of the haboob. They weren't moving like victors in a propaganda film. They moved with a heavy, unhurried, and bone-deep wariness of men who had done a job that was beneath them.
The SAS Mobility Troop. 4 men who looked like they'd been dragged through a gravel pit emerged from the haze, their crossbikes long since stashed, their gear covered in the fine, abrasive sand of the canyon floor. They were guiding the 7 American Rangers who stumbled toward the coalition lines with their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with the raw, jagged shock of survival. The Rangers were alive, shivering and profoundly, utterly embarrassed. The American Marines at the perimeter didn't cheer. They didn't break formation. They stood frozen, their rifles pointed at the ground as they watched the impossible walk toward them. General Miller's hand, which had been poised to trigger the final command to the bombers, went limp. The radio in his other hand crackled with the pilot of the lead B-52, his voice crisp, oblivious and chillingly precise. "Command, we are 2 minutes to release. Confirm target lock. Do we initiate the strike?" The general didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the muddy, exhausted, and unmistakably alive Rangers who were being guided toward his tent by 4 men who didn't even have the decency to look like they had just engaged in a legendary battle. They looked bored. They looked tired. And they looked like they were already thinking about their next cup of coffee back in the British compound. The SBS team lead, a man whose face was a map of cynical indifference, walked straight up to Miller. He didn't salute. He didn't wait for a debrief. He simply reached into the damp pocket of his tactical vest and pulled out a small, blood-stained digital camera, the kind the insurgents had used to film their demands. He tossed it onto the general's map table, where it clattered against a stack of unread intelligence briefs. "Your men are accounted for, General," the operator said, his voice as flat and unremarkable as a briefing on weather conditions.
"The tunnel's clear. The fortress is occupied by your people, or what's left of it, and the insurgents have abandoned the northern sector. We've done the heavy lifting. I'd suggest you use your bombers for something else, if you still have a mission left. We're done." The SAS team didn't wait for a thank you. They didn't ask for a commendation. They simply turned around, their heavy boots leaving muddy, sand-caked tracks on the general's gleaming, spit-polished floor, and walked out. They were leaving behind a room full of the most advanced soldiers in the world, men who were currently standing in the presence of a success that made their entire professional existence, the tanks, the drones, the billions in R&D, look like a high-budget, low-impact hobby. General Miller stood there, surrounded by his big machine, watching the 4 British operators disappear toward their own, far more austere and far more effective compound. He had the power.
He had the military-industrial complex. He had the authority. But he had been rendered completely, utterly irrelevant. He had been humiliated, not by a superior force, but by the fact that he was simply unnecessary. He didn't give the order to bomb. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, realizing that his entire career had been reduced to a footnote in a story about 4 men on motorcycles who knew how to use a compass. The Pentagon's PR machine went into overdrive by noon. They released a statement about coordinated coalition tactical success and the bravery of the US Rangers in maintaining the perimeter. They tried to scrub the dirt bike detail from the record. They tried to erase the fact that the Abrams tanks and the Reaper drones had been irrelevant. They tried to frame the mission as a triumph of American overmatch. But the veterans of the US Army knew. The Rangers who had been saved, who had seen the precision of the British work, knew.
And the general knew. The story was scrubbed within hours.
The Pentagon's files were locked away, and the incident was classified under a series of operational security warnings. It became the legend of the Sandstorm ghosts. It was the ultimate, bitter lesson of the modern era. The military-industrial complex loves to sell you on the next generation of warfare, the tech, the speed, the massive displays of iron. But when the lights go out and the pressure is on, the next generation often fails. The ones who win are the ones who understand that the environment is your weapon, and that the best way to handle a giant is to simply step around him. The British SBS didn't care about the press releases. They didn't care that their contribution had been erased from the official version of the war. They knew. The insurgents knew. And most importantly, the Americans knew. Every time those Rangers had to look at a motorcycle in the street, every time they had to sit in their heavy, sweltering Strykers, they were reminded of the 4 men who had shown them that all the armor in the world doesn't matter if you don't have the stomach to face the city on its own terms. This is the secret history of the Sandstorm rescue. It is the story of how 4 men on a budget of $500 humiliated a superpower, not because they were better, but because they were smarter, faster, and, most importantly, because they didn't need the world to see them to know that they had won. The US military-industrial complex loves the Hollywood version of the raid. The helicopters, the rappelling, the massive firefights, because that's what sells the budget. That's what keeps the contracts rolling in. But the real work is done in the dark, in the tunnel, and by the men who don't care if the general ever knows their name. If you're tired of the spin, if you want the real story of who's actually winning in the shadows, then hit that subscribe button.
We're here to dismantle the myth of the superpower and show you that the world is being won by men you will never see, in places you will never hear about, using methods that the Pentagon will never admit exist. Drop a comment below. Do you think the US will ever admit that a dirt bike and a compass are more effective than an entire armored division? Or is the theater of war too important to their ego to ever let go of the big, noisy toys? We're here to tell the truth, no matter who it upsets. Hit that bell, stay observant, and never forget. The loudest weapon on the battlefield is usually the one that's accomplishing the least. We'll see you in the next one, and trust